Right, off we go.
Welcome to Casual Politics, Alex Salmond. Thank you very much. It was very quick, but thank you very much for accepting my request, and I'm very grateful to you.
Well, it's a real pleasure. I've been waiting all of my political career to be on Casual Politics.
So happy ending. Thank you very much. First, please allow me to congratulate you that you came back to Westminster after 10 years of absentee. How exciting was that to be back in Westminster?
Well, it wasn't quite 10 years. I was in the 2005 to 2010 Parliament, but for the last 3 years of that I was First Minister of Scotland, so obviously that I had to devote my duties and time to doing that job. So I suppose it was like 7 or 8 years. But it's quite interesting. I mean, when I was here for all these years, I had to run round and look like a crowd because there was 3 of us, there were 5 of us, there was 6 of us. So I had to run round and look very much like a crowd. But now, of course, we are a crowd. So it's much different and much better.
And when you announced your resignation as First Minister of Scotland, why did you decide afterwards to announce that you're going to become a member of Parliament?
Well, I said I was a candidate. I mean, whether you become a member of Parliament or not, it's up to the people in the constituency. But in December, we were at a period where...
But you knew that you were going to get elected.
No, you never know that. And people who assume they're going to get elected usually end up not getting elected. So I've never made that assumption. I've stood for Parliament between the Scottish and Westminster Parliament 9 times, and I've been elected 9 times, and not one of these occasions did I ever assume I was going to be elected. And the political graveyard is littered with the corpses of those who assumed they were going to be elected. Never a good idea. So I stood because it was clear that, as I suspected, in the aftermath of the referendum, Scottish politics had fundamentally changed. But of course there was an argument, if the SNP were going to be successful, really successful, that we should have an element of experience in the representatives in the House of Commons. And I tended to have that experience. So I thought it'd be useful to the group. A big group. I didn't realise how big at that stage. I mean, I thought maybe 30, maybe 40. But 56 was a surprise. Even on a polling day, I've had this thing that for many elections I write down, and my wife makes me write down in the morning how many seats we're going to win. And on the polling day I wrote down 51. Which was more than most people's expectations, yes. But it's still not 56. So, but I was aware in December. I thought, look, the SNP do well in the election and conduct themselves properly, we're going to make a big breakthrough. Therefore, it's important that group of predominantly new members of Parliament needed people with a bit of experience to show them the ropes and to help out with the balance of the group. So that was really the thing that was most influenced my decision making.
And now your party is back with 56 MPs, the third largest party in Westminster. How surprising was that?
Well, we knew things would move in our direction. I felt after the referendum politics had changed in Scotland, probably changed for good. I knew the Labour Party were vulnerable. The Tories are disliked by people because of the Labour Party collapse. They tend to forget the Tories had their worst election result in Scotland for 100 years. And the Liberals, of course, were wiped out, all bar one member who's still clinging on a bit uncertainly. So it was a surprise. The extent of the victory was a surprise, but the victory itself, I would submit, was not a surprise. The victory was dictated by what happened in the referendum campaign last September. And because that changed the colour of people's thought in Scotland, then things were flowing in an SNP direction, and it was only a question of how quick and how rapid that flow was.
And to what extent Tories' message that did cut through to a wider electorate that your party will form a coalition with the Labour Party?
Well, I mean, we made, Nicola Sturgeon, I think very ably, made the case very strongly that we weren't interested in any deals with the Tory party, formal, informal, or any other kind. Therefore, the only coalition which stood a chance of stopping the Tories winning another term and setting about, as they are doing now, a politics of great austerity and difficulty for many, many people in this country. The only alternative was to build a progressive alliance. And the Labour Party, of course, totally missed their opportunity, and instead of embracing that idea, which would have, I think, carried a lot of support here in England as well as Scotland, they turned their back on it. They said they weren't going to do it. They behaved like spoilt children. And of course, once a party does that, and once a leadership is so weak as the leadership of Ed Miliband most certainly was, then of course support just ebbed away from the Labour Party. They mishandled the campaign fundamentally, and they paid a very heavy price for it. And the people are going to pay a heavy price for the Labour Party's inability to gain any ground in England from the Conservatives, a major piece of political incompetence which everybody else is going to pay a high price for.
But why you didn't want any deals this time with the Tories? Because when you were First Minister of Scotland, you did a deal with the Tories since actually it was in 2007.
No,
so why did not
it's not
this
correct.
time?
I keep reading that in the metropolitan papers. It's just untrue. When you're a minority government, you have to seek support from any party who will give you it. Therefore, for example, we got support from the Tories to reduce small business rates, but we got support from the Liberals to abolish tuition fees in Scotland. We got support from the Labour Party to abolish prescription fees in the National Health Service in Scotland. And we got support from the Greens on a fairly consistent basis. That's nothing to do with doing a deal with the Tories. It's just looking for support as a minority government from where you can find it in a chamber. I hear this point made very foolishly by people who know absolutely nothing about the Scottish Parliament. That's not how it is. In a minority government in the Scottish Parliament, you have to try and build a majority issue by issue, which is what we did very successfully. In fact, it was so successful that people decided to put us in as a majority government in 2011.
And before the actually the Scottish referendum, the Tories, the establishment, they promised to devote more powers to Scotland. And after the Scottish referendum, do you think after 6 months, do you think that they broke those promises?
Yes, I do, and they were seen to be breaking them during the election campaign, which is why they got totally dismissed by the people of Scotland in such a humiliating fashion. I mean, one Conservative MP with 14% of the vote, the worst Tory result for a century, and now they're compounding that error. Instead of listening to the people in the referendum, instead of honouring the promises and commitments they made during the referendum and the vow, as it was called, instead of listening to people in the general election, instead of understanding that their policy has been rejected, they now seem intent on just blundering on as if nothing had happened. Well, I'm afraid a great deal has happened, a great deal has changed. And the Tory party are setting up the position that the people in Scotland will not tolerate the behaviour that we're seeing from the Prime Minister. You cannot defy the democratic will of a people. And the sooner the Conservative Party realises that, the better from their point of view.
And what were those promises?
Well, the promises were quite explicit. I mean, the vow was articulated in the last few days of the referendum as being Home Rule. Now, Home Rule was generally understood as control of everything apart from defence and foreign affairs. That's what Home Rule means. Devo to the max, a devolution to the maximum, and which means control of your own budget, if it means anything at all. And as the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown put it, who was effectively leading the No campaign by then, as near federalism as you can get, as he put it. Now, none of that, near federalism, Home Rule, Devo to the max, is contained in the proposals that the government is now making as far as Scotland's concerned. Nobody could seriously describe the very minimalist approach to further devolution, to real control of finance, as anything near Home Rule, Devo to the max, or near federalism. So they've broken the vow they made after the referendum, and then they failed to listen to the clearly enunciated, delivered verdict of the Scottish people during an election campaign. That, I think, is a recipe for from the Conservatives' point of view, from abject rejection by the Scottish people time and time again. Parties which don't listen to democracy and the people of Scotland pay a heavy price. The Labour Party have paid it. The Conservative Party will continue to pay it until they see sense and actually deliver what they promised to deliver.
And English votes on English laws, why is it unfair?
I never said it was unfair. I've never said that. In fact, I've been sympathetic to it right through my political career. The problem is, of course, is the Tory party define it in a way which is far too broad. I mean, anything that touches finance, in the absence of Home Rule, Devo to the max, or near federalism, of course, but if you don't do that, anything which touches finance touches Scotland. So a vote on the English Health Service, if it affects the amount of money spent in the English Health Service, that in turn, through the current funding formula, affects the money that's spent in Scotland. So if you start to define it as votes which are about the English Health Service, then of course that is constitutionally incorrect. That is not English votes for English MPs. That is English votes which affect Scotland, and therefore Scotland has to be able to vote on them. And then there's a question of process. If you're going to make a change like that, you can't just do it in the dead of night when nobody's looking. You've got to have a proper constitutional bill and discuss it seriously and properly with the people. You can't sort of shove it through because you think the Labour Party is too inept, too weak and too leaderless to do anything about it. It has to be properly discussed, properly debated. It has to be done in a set fashion. So in both these matters, trying to draw this far too widely, but also trying to shove it through in a change of standing orders, the Conservative Party are totally deficient and shouldn't be allowed to get away with it.
And a while ago, Paddy Ashdown, the former Liberal Democrats leader, said on your party that the only reason that you're at Westminster is to make it dysfunctional in order to break away from the United Kingdom. Like in the Balkans. So, what do you make of his comment?
Well, not much. I mean, Paddy Ashdown, a voice from the past. I don't think Paddy Ashdown knows very much about Scotland or about the SNP and certainly the Liberal Democrats. I think people like Paddy Ashdown should just go away and reflect on why their party has been totally abjectly humiliated in Scotland. Paddy Ashdown was a prime supporter of the Conservative Liberal Democrat alliance, which has destroyed the Liberal Democratic Party. He was the organiser of the Liberal Democrats election campaign, which resulted in the loss of just about all of their seats. I think it's time for Lord Ashdown to go and reflect on perhaps the fact he's misjudged the mood and the moment, as well as misjudging the nation of Scotland.
And on the EU referendum, you are unashamedly a Europhile. And why didn't your party, including yourself, you joined forces with Tory Eurosceptics?
Yeah, and so should the Labour Party. Because the issue at stake was not whether the referendum should be yes or no, but whether it should be fairly conducted. And the government are quite clearly trying to abolish spending rules, to suspend purdah, that period before an election on a referendum where the government is not allowed to campaign. And these things are absolutely fundamental to democracy. And last week in the House of Commons we had the extraordinary situation of the Labour Party presented with an opportunity to defeat this government, sat in their hands, abstained, couldn't be bothered to vote. It was the right thing for the SNP to vote for fairness, not because we are pro-European or anti-European, because any Democrat should have voted in that direction last week. The Labour Party, well, of course, they're a party in turmoil, a party without a leader, the party internally divided. They're in a poor state at the present moment, but any Democrat would have voted in that direction, because whether you're for or against Europe, whether you're for it like me or against it like some of the Tory rebels, you should want to have a fair referendum. If you don't have a fair referendum, then it causes huge grievance, huge injustice, and people, of course, will shrug their shoulders and not accept the result. And many of the mistakes that the government intend to make in this referendum, they made in the Scottish referendum. We know what happened in the Scottish referendum. They broke purdah. They invented a new vow. You've just asked me about it, a new declaration, which you're not meant to do in the last few days of a campaign. They had civil servants like Sir Nicholas Macpherson campaigning almost as if they were politicians, with treasury briefings to the press. Civil servants are meant to be neutral during an election or referendum campaign. So fundamental breaches of a democratic system. They happened during the Scottish referendum. They shouldn't be allowed to happen in a European referendum. And any Democrat, whether they're a pro-European or an anti-European, whether they're a Europhile like me or a Europhobe like the Eurosceptics, they should want to make sure that a referendum is fair and square and above board.
And do you think that the government should spend money to campaign for Britain to stay within the European Union?
The government's entitled to put forward its point of view up until the period of the election or referendum, the 28 days, the purdah period. That happens in every general election. And once you get to that 28-day period, then there are severe restrictions, quite properly, on what the government does as a government, because it's then time for people to decide. Politicians, of course, are entitled to campaign as politicians, but they shouldn't campaign as a government. They shouldn't use government influence in that campaign period, no more than we'd find it acceptable during a general election or a Scottish election. And the civil service, which are the most insidious part of this, I mean, their behaviour of the United Kingdom Treasury during the Scottish referendum was a disgrace, a democratic disgrace. And it's quite interesting that many of the people who shrugged their shoulders and said, oh, we don't care about that, during the Scottish referendum, of course, are now up to high dough in the European referendum as they see that unfairness, the behaviour of Sir Nicholas Macpherson and his department repeated, or potentially repeated during a European poll. And that's what I said in the House of Commons last week, and I'll continue to name names and say exactly what was done during the Scottish referendum so that people understand it and make sure we prevent such a thing happening during a European referendum.
And what do you make of David Cameron's renegotiations? Are they similar to Harold Wilson renegotiations back in 1975?
Harold Wilson was much more substantial.
Oh, was he?
Well, of course he was. I mean, Harold Wilson. Well, two things about Harold Wilson. One,
he lied to the voters, didn't he?
No, I think Harold Wilson was much more substantial politician than David Cameron will ever be. I think Wilson had a much more tricky hand to play, but he played it much better. I mean, he had a form of negotiation, and then he allowed his cabinet, of course, to speak their minds on the issue, and they had a free vote on the issue. David Cameron, well, first of all, he said he wasn't going to do that. Then, of course, he took fright, and now he's not so sure. The smack of firm government from David Cameron lasted about 24 hours. I think David Cameron looks increasingly like, well, it looks more like John Major than Margaret Thatcher.
And do you think that the bastards are they back in the government?
Well, what I think is that the term, I know John Major quite well, and whatever else you say about John, he doesn't usually go around with, swearing and off or on camera or behaving like that. And therefore, the description he made of the people in his cabinet, people like John Redwood and others, he was pushed to the end of his tether, and you can see some of the same issues emerging in the Conservative Party. If the Labour Party had the guts and the gumption to beat the Tories last week, as they should have done, then we'd have seen these divisions laid bare for all to see. The Conservatives are viscerally divided on the issue of Europe, and that looks like it's going to be the case for some time to come.
And what powers do you want to be repatriated from Brussels to the UK?
Well, I'm afraid the only power I want to see repatriated is the fisheries policy. If we're going to have a treaty negotiation, then let's have a renegotiation on the key European policy that doesn't work, which is the common fisheries policy. Trouble is that David Cameron never mentions that. He's not bothered about that. He bumbles on about people from Poland not being able to repatriate their child benefit, which is, it's an infinitesimally small issue in terms of the nature of things we're talking about. And major issues which matter to real communities and real people like the fisheries policy are just swept aside. He couldn't give a stuff about that. But what I actually want about Europe, I don't want to see Europe doing less, I want to see Europe doing more. I want to see a Europe that acts on the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean. I want to see a European Union that acts on social policy. It says instead of stopping people getting a living wage through competition policy, it actually says, no, we're going to enforce a living wage, we're going to facilitate a living wage. I want to see a Europe which acts on climate change, on the environment. So while David Cameron's giving us a sort of nebulous list of things he wants Europe not to be doing, I've got a very firm list of things I want Europe to be doing. That's the sort of positive vision of Europe that I want to see promulgated in this campaign, a real vision for a new Europe, not David Cameron's really rather petty and demeaning little Englanderism.
And do you think that if Britain decides to leave the European Union, would it produce a clamour over another independence in Scotland?
Well, I think Nicola Sturgeon's identified quite correctly that that circumstance of Scotland voting yes, England voting no, Scotland being dragged out of the European Union against our will, or the prospect of it, that would provide the change in material circumstances that she's pointed to as giving the causal base for another constitutional independence referendum in Scotland. Yes, I do.
And you're also spokesman for foreign affairs of your party. Do you think that the government should ring-fence the defence budget?
No, I don't actually. I think we should spend the defence budget much better as opposed to increasing it. I think it would be far better if, for example, we contributed to NATO by having secure conventional defences as opposed to wasting or proposing to waste £100,000 million on a new generation of nuclear weapons that can never be used, that add nothing to the nuclear balance in the world, that create imbalances through proliferation, which send the wrong message to dozens of countries. That the idea that you can only be something in the world if you've got nuclear weapons. What a pathetic message to send out to the rest of humanity. You should be judged as a country on the quality of your ideas, on the compassion of your international policy, on the strength of your economy, the excellence of your education, not by the number of nuclear missiles you can.
But why do you want to get rid of a Trident? Because now the world has become a very dangerous place to live in with Russia and.
I was just explaining that to you.
Yes.
Firstly, the Trident adds nothing to nuclear balance. This country is a member of the NATO alliance. The NATO alliance is anchored by the American nuclear deterrent. Having a UK independent deterrent, which is not independent in the first place, adds absolutely nothing to that nuclear balance. If you think it does, then why doesn't Germany, a country vastly more wealthy than the UK now, why doesn't Germany have nuclear weapons? And if Germany's going to have nuclear weapons, why doesn't other countries have nuclear weapons? Why doesn't everybody have nuclear weapons? It's an argument which will take us to perdition and to probably to nuclear destruction. And what the UK has to realise, and every single person in the UK, if you make that argument for the UK, then you cannot argue against it for any other country in the world. As far as Trident's concerned, it's an instability in world affairs, not a stability. We should get rid of it, and we should take the opportunity to get rid of it. Secondly, we can't afford it. We don't have £100 billion. I don't know if you've noticed, but people are starving in this country. They're going to food banks. People are being reduced to penury. The very last thing we should be spending money on is £100 billion on a new generation of nuclear weapons, or for that matter, £6 billion on a new revised parliamentary estate around Westminster. We should spend it on what people need, not on what people don't need. And lastly, if we're talking about emerging states with nuclear weapons, quite apart from the miserable example we set by having an independent so-called nuclear deterrent, then you wouldn't devise a Trident nuclear system in order to balance that threat. The Trident nuclear system was devised to penetrate the defences around Moscow during the Cold War. It's not an answer to a country like Iran or any of the aspirant nuclear powers. It's a nonsense argument. And if we could afford it, which we can't, we shouldn't do it, but we can't afford it and we mustn't do it, because the penalty of going for Trident means that things that we should be doing, like policing our waters, like stopping Russian destroyers sailing up the Murray Firth, like knowing what's going on, we can't do, because we've got no air reconnaissance left, because we're pumping all our money into a totally useless generation of military playthings called Trident missiles. That's why it shouldn't happen.
And my last question, what are those challenges that the Conservative government will face over the next 5 years, and will you help them to overcome those challenges?
Well, I think the biggest challenge they face, as far as I'm concerned, is something which is implicit in the nature of conservatism. And that is they govern partially for some of the country against the interests of the vast majority of people. In this election, they got 37% of the country voting for them. The tragedy is that the other 63% of the country will bear the cost as the Conservative Party, as it always has done, pursues its own interests. It'll do it ruthlessly, it'll do it viciously, but as far as Scotland's concerned, they're about to become seriously unstuck.
And we shall wait and see.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Alex. It's a great pleasure.
Right.
Thank you.